They thought I was finished before I even had a chance to speak. That was their first mistake, and by the end of the day, it would become their last. It started in the most absurd way imaginable. I was standing in my own office, the one I had quietly shaped over decades, when a woman I had never met looked up from a brand new company laptop and calmly informed me that I was being terminated effective. She did not offer a handshake, did not explain the reasoning, and barely even made eye contact. Behind her stood a nervous HR assistant who looked like he had just been asked to witness something he did not understand. The whole moment felt surreal, like watching a stranger try to take control of a machine they had never even seen before. Her name was Lauren Hayes, though I would not learn that until later. At that moment, she was just the CEO's daughter-in-law, newly installed, freshly confident, and dangerously unaware of what she had stepped into. Her posture was perfect, her tone rehearsed, and her delivery so precise that it was obvious someone had fed her the exact words she was now repeating. She did not hesitate, did not question herself, and did not pause long enough to notice the quiet weight of the room she was standing in. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. After decades of navigating egos, boardroom politics, and fragile alliances, I had learned that power rarely announces itself through noise. Instead, I stood up slowly, adjusted my jacket, and placed my badge on the desk with a calm that clearly confused her. I told her I wanted to handle this properly, and then I added one small detail that barely registered at the time, but would echo loudly within hours. I told her to inform her father-in-law that the board meeting scheduled for later that day would be very interesting. Then I walked out. I passed the HR assistant, who looked like he wanted to say something but did not know what. I passed the security guard, who seemed more uncertain than authoritative. I passed the lobby, where a framed photo of the founding family hung proudly on the wall, carefully curated to exclude the one person who had built the legal foundation of everything they claimed to own. And then I stepped outside, not as someone who had just lost control, but as someone who had just set a process in motion. You see, Lauren believed she had made her first decisive leadership move. In reality, she had triggered something that had been waiting quietly for nearly 2 decades. 3 hours. That was the window between her decision and the unraveling of everything she thought she had gained. While she likely celebrated her new authority, perhaps even drafting a polished announcement about strong leadership and bold decisions, I was finalizing documentation that would shift the entire structure of the company back into my hands. There was a clause buried deep within the original shareholder agreement. It was not flashy, not widely discussed, and certainly not something anyone expected to use. I wrote it myself during a time when the company was still fragile, when reckless decisions could have destroyed everything overnight. It was designed as a safeguard, a last resort against incompetence or impulsive leadership. That clause stated that if a corporate officer was terminated by someone without equity and without a formal board vote, all executive authority granted to that person would be immediately suspended. Control would revert to the majority shareholder, and an emergency board meeting would be required within hours. I was the majority shareholder. By the time Lauren finished celebrating her first act of authority, I had already activated the clause. Every document was signed, notarized, and distributed to board members, investors, and legal counsel. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, and no way to undo it once it had been filed. The system did not care about her title, her last name, or her confidence. It only cared about what was written and what had been agreed upon. And what had been agreed upon gave me control. To understand how that was possible, you have to go back to the beginning. Long before the company had glass offices and polished branding, it was nothing more than a chaotic idea held together by ambition and luck. The founder had vision, but he lacked structure. Deals were made without documentation. Money moved without tracking. And decisions were driven by instinct rather than strategy. I stepped in to fix that. At first, I was offered titles: vice president, roles, positions that sounded impressive but meant very little in the long term. I declined them all. Instead, I asked for equity. Small percentages at first, barely noticeable, but consistent. Every deal, every crisis, every moment where stability was required, I negotiated another piece. Over time, those pieces added up. By the 3rd year, I held a significant stake. By the 8th, I had become impossible to ignore. When others left, whether through conflict or necessity, I acquired their shares. When legal disputes threatened the company, I resolved them in ways that strengthened my position. Quietly, steadily, without ever needing recognition, I built ownership. Eventually, I held 72%. No one paid attention because I never demanded attention. I did not need a title when I controlled the outcome. I did not need public recognition when the contracts already spoke for me. And within those contracts was the clause that Lauren had unknowingly activated. Back in the present, the fallout was already beginning. Board members across different cities were receiving the legal packet. At first, the reaction was confusion, then concern, and finally realization. The language was clear, and the implications impossible to ignore. This was not a minor internal issue. It was a structural crisis with legal consequences that could affect every person involved. The founder was the last to understand. He was interrupted during a routine day, pulled away from his usual comforts, and brought back to the office with urgency he had not experienced in years. By the time he arrived, the atmosphere had shifted. There was no confidence left in the room, only tension and the quiet understanding that something irreversible had already happened. When the clause was explained to him, he struggled to process it. He insisted it must be a misunderstanding, that it could be reversed, that a simple conversation would fix everything. But the law does not operate on intention, and contracts do not bend to regret. Lauren, meanwhile, was beginning to notice the cracks. Systems she expected to control were rejecting her access. Approvals were denied. Dashboards were locked. Communication channels went silent. What she interpreted as temporary technical issues were actually the early signs of her authority being stripped away. Then came the board meeting. She entered with the same confidence she had shown earlier, expecting to lead, to assert control, to continue the narrative she had already started building in her mind. Instead, she was told she could observe, but not participate. Her position had been suspended, her authority revoked. And then I walked in. I did not rush. I did not make an entrance. I simply entered the room and took the place that had always been mine, whether they acknowledged it or not. The conversation shifted immediately, not because of anything I said, but because of what everyone in that room now understood. I requested a vote to rescind all recent executive appointments and to begin a full review of the company's leadership structure. It was not emotional, not personal, just necessary. The founder said very little. He no longer had the leverage he once believed he held. The board complied, not out of loyalty, but out of obligation to the agreements they had all signed. After the meeting, I gave him a choice. He could buy me out at a premium and retain control of what remained, or he could accept a complete restructuring under my leadership. There were no hidden conditions, no manipulation, just clarity. The next morning, he chose to step down. Lauren did not return. The company continued, not with dramatic announcements or public spectacle, but with quiet, deliberate changes. Systems were corrected, leadership redefined, and the foundation restored to what it was always meant to be. As for me, I returned to the same building I had walked out of, not as someone reclaiming power, but as someone who had never actually lost it. Because real control is not something you can take with a title or a decision made on impulse. It is built over time, written into the structure, and protected by the kind of foresight most people never think to value. And if there is one thing that day proved beyond any doubt, it is this. You can remove a person from an office, but you cannot remove the person who owns the system.